talk about the cost of the war in Iraq and the status of training Iraqis to take over security from U.S. forces. A House Appropriations Subcommittee hosted the hearing, and Deputy Secretary of State Richard Armitage also testified. It's about 2 hours and 20 minutes.
The Subcommittee on Appropriations, Foreign Operations will come to order. And this morning, we are very happy to have two very distinguished members of the administration with us. Deputy Secretary Armitage, Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz, we welcome you to this hearing. Today, before the Foreign Operations Subcommittee, we're focusing today on the administration's fiscal year 2005 budget request for security assistance. This includes funding that comes under the Economic Support Fund, the Andean Counter-Drug Initiative, the Non-Proliferation Anti-Terrorism, Demining, and Other Programs account, the Foreign Military Financing Program, International Military Education and Training, and Peacekeeping Operations. Deputy Secretary Armitage is here because the State Department has the lead as a matter of law and of policy on security assistance issues. Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz is here because the Defense Department implements several major security assistance programs, including the former Foreign Military Financing Program and the International Military Education and Training Programs. In fact, approximately $5 billion of the fiscal year 2005 Foreign Operations budget request would be implemented by the Department of Defense through Defense Security Cooperation Agency. Since 9/11, we've been engaged in a global war on terrorism that challenges the assumptions underlying our security assistance, funding, and policies. After the end of the Cold War, the security assistance component of the foreign assistance budget declined dramatically. By the mid-1990s, it consisted of programs for Israel, Egypt, and not much else. At the time, that might have seemed to be the appropriate thing to do. However, we need to recognize that the global war on terrorism means we have to have a much more robust and a much more flexible security assistance budget. And I believe that our subcommittee has responded positively in that regard in the last few years. At the same time, the relative roles of the Department of State and Departments of State and Department of Defense in the provision of security assistance have been changing. The Defense Department has sought, some would say with considerable success, to expand its authority and increase its funding to implement security assistance program independent of the Department of State. Within the administration, the diffusion of responsibility for establishing, implementing, and funding security assistance program has led at times to bureaucratic infighting and the loss of central command and control. At worst, it has led to different parts of the U.S. government pursuing different policies in a single country. This creates challenges for the Congress. Rather than centralizing oversight for security assistance programs under one authorizing committee and one appropriations subcommittee, responsibility has become more diffused and perhaps more confused. But let's acknowledge our own responsibility in this regard. All too often, this subcommittee or the authorizing committees impose limitations on security assistance for countries that may not be relevant in a post-9/11 world. A good example is our prohibition on full IMET for Indonesia. By abdicating responsibility on military-to-military programs, we allow often one department, the Defense Department, to fill a vacuum, since the importance of cooperation on anti-terrorism activities virtually mandates that we engage with the Indonesian military. One can debate the efficacy of expanded DoD authorities in the area of security assistance. However, we also have a unique situation in Iraq. There, the entire foreign assistance emergency supplemental of $18.4 billion has been largely programmed and managed by the Department of Defense through the Coalition Provisional Authority. I opposed this arrangement last year, but the Department of Defense prevailed. 6 months have passed since Congress approved the funding on an emergency basis. As of the latest report available to the subcommittee, only $2.24 billion of the $18.4 billion has been obligated. Even less has been expended. I have very serious concerns about the pace of assistance funding in Iraq and the management of those funds. Secretary Wolfowitz, you will need to assure the subcommittee that the Department of Defense is fulfilling its fiduciary responsibility to the taxpayers and to our troops who are relying on a successful implementation of this program, and that the Department is taking aggressive steps to expedite foreign assistance activities. Since we have two witnesses with us today, I'd like to ask if each of you, if possible, can hold your opening remarks to 5 minutes. Of course, we'll put the full statements in the record. And as the representative of the senior Department of Government, I'll call on Deputy Secretary Armitage first, but prior to that, let me ask Mrs. Lowy for her opening statement. Ms. Lowy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I join Chairman Colby in welcoming our guests to this hearing this morning. We need to cover a wide range of topics this morning, and I hope we will have the time to discuss the situation in Iraq and other fronts in the war on terrorism. As you know, I did support authorizing the President to use force against Iraq, and since the start of hostilities, I have supported providing adequate funding for our troops and for reconstruction efforts. Despite my obvious concerns about the way the war and its aftermath has been prosecuted, I believe that the United States does have a responsibility to see this mission through to a successful completion. The security and stability of the Middle East is at stake, with potentially enormous ramifications for the United States' national security. As we approach the anniversary of the President's declaration of the end of major hostilities in Iraq, the overall security situation appears to have worsened. A fierce insurgency driven by terrorist tactics has slowed the pace of reconstruction and has left Iraq well short of its goal of democracy and stability. Regardless of whether or not we anticipated this type of reaction to our occupation, we have been forced to spend a great deal of time and resources dealing with it. Unfortunately, as we approach the June 30th transition, the violence is likely to increase. I hope you can both provide candid assessments today of what the American people should expect on this front and what the ultimate financial costs of the war will be. I have a number of questions about our reconstruction effort and the transition to State Department control. We are aware of internal discussions between State and DoD on how the CPA will transform into an embassy operation. Who ultimately will control construction funds? Will our ambassador control reconstruction funds, or will DoD through the Program Management Office? From the outset, I've maintained that too much emphasis has been placed on construction and not enough on improving Iraq's government institutions, schools, and hospitals. I have questioned whether we can pave our way out of Iraq. And with DoD controlling priorities, however, we have devoted huge sums to infrastructure projects, which would take a long time to complete, even in the best of circumstances. This approach has yielded few visible signs of our reconstruction efforts, leaving many Iraqis with the impression that the United States is doing nothing to improve their daily lives. So I'd be most appreciative if you can discuss this issue and what plans we have to remedy this. I understand that managing the conflict in Iraq is a fluid process. We have to roll with the punches, certainly, and make adjustments to our plans when necessary. But the adjustments should not be unilaterally made. Congress has a constitutionally mandated role both in the initiation of hostilities and in their aftermath. I hope that as the transition to Iraqi rule approaches, the administration will view Congress as a partner rather than an irritation. With respect to other areas, I'd like to note that the only significant increases requested in the security assistance budget for 2005 are for Afghanistan and Pakistan. In my view, our focus on Iraq, combined with large increases in support for specific presidential initiatives, is threatening to hamper our ability to respond now to potential future terrorism threats. Funding requests for Central Asian countries, areas of conflict in Africa, have been straight-lined or cut. We continue to devote large sums to Colombia while ignoring the rest of the Western Hemisphere. In Asia, we see modest increases in assistance for the Philippines and Indonesia, but no attempt to deal decisively with the terrorist threat with more widespread assistance programs. It's no secret that we anticipate an allocation well below the President's request, unfortunately, which will force difficult choices. I believe the consensus on the committee will be to find room for the increases requested for Afghanistan and Pakistan, as well as for HIV/AIDS programs. And unfortunately, this will mean cuts in other areas, which could include security assistance. It will most definitely mean that we will lose opportunities to be creative with our assistance in other areas that affect stability, such as basic education. The United States is currently engaged in some extraordinarily complicated and critical missions around the world. To be successful in these endeavors, all oars need to be pulling in the same direction. And this means creating and nurturing an atmosphere of trust and collaboration between the administration and Congress, and it means true cooperation rather than competition between the various agencies that participate in these efforts. From where I sit, I'm concerned that we have not yet achieved either of these goals, and I look forward to your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Ms. Loy. Secretary Armitage, will proceed with you, and then Secretary Wolfowitz with opening statements, and then we'll go to questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ms. Loy, members. I'll not make an opening statement beyond saying that it's the questions and the answers which you enjoy and which you learn from, and then we actually learn from, not only your concerns, but where we need to do more work. This subcommittee has been extraordinarily supportive where you agreed with us. You have been extraordinarily agreeable when you disagreed with us. And I think it fosters that kind of cooperation between the executive and the legislative branch, and we certainly pledge to do our part to continue that. And I don't mean in any way to suggest that your questioning has been unstinting in any way. Been pretty probing, both in the hearings and when we field calls, telephone calls back and forth from various members. So I know of the interest of the subcommittee. I think I might pay highest tribute to the subcommittee by telling you a short story. I'm a little like Lee at Appomattox today, Mr. Chairman. I've come to surrender my sword. You've got a couple of staff members on your excellent subcommittee who I actually tried to hire to be Deputy Assistant Secretary in my department, not exactly an insubstantial post or one without a lot of duties and responsibilities, but both John Shank and Rodney Bent turned me down and came to you. So this subcommittee has really got something going for it, so I surrender my symbolic sword to you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Lowy.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary Wolfowitz.
I don't think we can sorry. I can't match that except to say that. Can you hear me now? Okay. I can't match that except to say I didn't even try to hire those people. I knew a losing fight before we started. I just you have my written statement, and that's available. I just, first of all, like to strongly endorse the State Department request for security assistance and indeed their whole foreign assistance request, and to emphasize that in this war on terrorism one can't make artificial distinctions between the military and the civilian side of things. Indeed, it is part of this war is in fact to achieve reform in the education system in Pakistan, for example. That's every bit as important in our view as the immediate wartime battlefield. And security assistance, I think, over the years has demonstrated its value. It's created relationships for us with some of the key people in key countries with whom we are fighting this war on terror. I think, in fact, in Pakistan, we're trying to overcome some of the difficulties of a long period in which we had no relationship with their military. So it's a very important appropriation. I'd also like to say that I think, and I think our testifying here together is some testimony to that, there's a lot less difference between our departments than you read about in the newspapers. We're united in a common interest in success in Iraq, and we've got to figure out the flexible ways to do that. We've gone through a period where police training, which is traditionally a State Department responsibility, and which I'm happy to have a State Department responsibility, needs to be done on a scale in Iraq where we mutually agreed with Ambassador Bremer's concurrence that at least until we got some of the major contracting and equipping and training things done, CENTCOM with 130,000 people in the theater has the capacity to do things that CPA with a couple of thousand people, which is pretty big for any civilian presence, simply can't get done, especially under these conditions. So the goal is to produce for the American people and for the American men and women who are in harm's way in Iraq. It is not to fight over departmental prerogatives. And in that same spirit, we very much appreciate Mr. Chairman and members of this committee and of the full committee, indeed of the full Congress, quite a bit of flexibility that you've given us in various appropriations, starting with the large $40 billion supplemental immediately after September 11th. We're back this year asking for some more flexibility, and I hope it can be taken in the spirit not of DOD trying to take over security assistance. We are certainly not, and indeed all of the new authority we're asking for would be subject to the concurrence of the State Department. But most of them bear on the simple issue of that in the field we have military units who are fighting side by side with Iraqi units, and because of many of the elaborate rules that are appropriate in peacetime for contracting, it is very difficult for them to get the kind of equipment into the hands of their Iraqi comrades that we can freely get for our American forces. This committee and the Congress have given us more flexibility in that area in the past, but we would like that flexibility extended particularly beyond the Iraqi army in limited amount to institutions like the Iraqi police and the Iraqi Civil Defense Corps. We share your concern about the importance of getting money out in the field. These projects, that non-military projects, are every bit as important to winning this war as the military piece. It is critical that we sustain the support of the Iraqi people. There has been a lot of progress in electricity, progress in school construction, enormous progress in the healthcare sector. The biggest deficiency, of course, is insecurity, and unless there's security, all of the other progress doesn't matter. I would note that of the $2.7 billion that has been obligated already, most of that is in three critical sectors: security, electricity, and democracy building. And we think that the pace of allocation is going to increase substantially over the coming months, since we now have, while it's $2.7 billion obligated, there's $6.4 billion already committed, and we expect that should move fairly quickly. One last comment. I think one of the things that we need to work on, and I've had very useful discussions already with Ambassador Negroponte, is not the allocation between civilian and military or state and defense, but rather between the center, between Baghdad and the provinces. And very often the substantial presence in those provinces is because of circumstances are military. The kinds of projects that Congresswoman Lowy referred to that would employ more Iraqis rather than pour more concrete through foreign contractors are precisely the kind of projects that our military favor. And the Congress has given us some substantial authority to draw on DOD funds for the CERP program, the Commander's Emergency Reserve Program. That is very valuable. We're also looking in the contracting process at how some more of the $18 billion supplemental might be moved out. Not, again, I repeat, this is not a prerogative between departments or between civilian and military, but there is a real issue of how much should be done through large centralized projects and how much should be done on a decentralized provincial basis. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much for this opening statements and for making them as brief as you did. It'll allow us to give more time for questions, and I know we have a number of members here, and I know we'll have a number of questions. We're going to, as we always do on this subcommittee, try to stay with the 5-minute rule, certainly at least on this first round, and I will impose that on myself. We understand that Secretary Wolfowitz has to leave fairly promptly at noon, so we're going to try to get through as many questions as possible. Let me begin with one that could be answered. Actually, I'd like an answer from both of you dealing with global peace operations. There was an article in the Washington Post on April 19th that described a plan to build foreign peace forces. According to that report, 75,000 additional foreign troops who could be deployed on short notice would be trained. for this range of peacekeeping activities. And it quotes Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Doug Feith in describing this initiative. But it wasn't until yesterday afternoon that the subcommittee received any information on this matter. And I think I would just say that, depending on the Washington Post, to give us the details of security assistance initiatives is not, in my view, a really good way to do business with Congress. But my questions are these to you. Let me start with these two to both of you. Would this initiative be subject to the policy direction of the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Defense? And how is it going to be funded, since there's nothing in the budget request for 2005? Secretary Armitage.
Mr. Chairman, Paul and I have jointly sent a letter that basically leaves some of this decision up to the Congress. We describe that what we envision is about 75,000 person force starting in Africa, training up peacekeeping people to be available for peacekeeping. It's about $100 million the first year and $660 over the 5-year life of this program, which initially will be funded about 20%, almost $20 million from the State Department, and as I understand it, 80 from the Department of Defense. Ours, since we'd be concentrating initially in Africa, would come out of the ACOTA funds. When I say we've left it up to the Congress, we know that we've jealously guarded our own prerogatives and the prerogatives of the Secretary of State. The fact of the matter is equally that there is a lot more money in the Department of Defense. So there is not a problem with concurrence whichever way the Congress goes and decides whether DOD should run the program or DOD should make funds available to the State Department to run the program. Either way is fine with both of us. That was the burden of our letter. So,
And how about the funding issue?
as I say, in the 05 request, I think we've got 19 plus in for a CODIS for the State Department.
Secretary Wolfowitz, did you want to add anything to that?
Basically, I think I'd agree with everything that Rich said and emphasize that this is an initiative designed to train other countries' forces so that when peacekeeping requirements come up, as they did recently in Liberia or as we're facing one in Haiti today, they're more capable foreign forces to draw on so that we're not constantly turning to our military for tasks that could be performed by others.
Keep the microphone right there, because this part may be for you, Secretary Wolfowitz. As a policy matter, how can we have a lot of confidence that foreign militaries are going to be in a position to substitute for the work of the U.S. military? Under what circumstances do you see them being used? And wouldn't it, from a practical standpoint, require that the interests of the country supplying the forces would have to be completely concurrent with our own? Otherwise, they're not going to agree to have their forces used in such a way.
It seems to me that, I mean, the heart of this, after all, is peacekeeping missions, and they're, by definition, missions that don't involve the kind of combat that our forces can do and do very well. Many countries can provide that capability. Many countries do, and in fact, I'd say in Liberia we had a success story where we went in initially because we were the only people who could get there quickly, but we were able to put together an international force, mostly of West African countries, that is doing that job now. And I think most often these would be situations where everyone would be operating under a UN mandate, and that would establish the purpose of it. I think one of the things we're encountering in Iraq is when you go beyond peacekeeping and you're in a combat situation, it begins to be a job that only the U.S. and a much smaller number of other countries can take on.
Let me shift, if I might, then, in the little time that I have here, to the issue of the pace of funding, the pace of spending from the supplemental in Iraq, which I alluded to and you also spoke of in your opening remarks, Secretary Wolfowitz. Last September, in arguing for the President's emergency supplemental, you said, and this is on the DoD website, the principle on which we hope people will look at the supplement is with a sense of urgency. If we can get electricity effectively fixed in Iraq quickly, it could save us vastly greater sums on the military side, because there's a very close relationship, in our view, between some of these investments in infrastructure and the ability to stabilize the situation so we can bring down our troop levels and make our troops safer, unquote. OMB, as I mentioned, recently reported that only about 19% of the $5.5 billion in resources for electricity sector had been obligated as of March 24th. Overall, the figure I gave, $2.2 billion of the 18, that's less than 15%. has been obligated. And the expenditure rates presumably lag behind that obligation number. You suggested that you thought the pace was going to pick up, but are you satisfied with the pace, or is the fact that it's not as fast as is solely due to the security issues?
I guess on different questions, it's different. In the case of electricity, actually, specifically, that number is only a fraction of what's been committed to electricity. There was substantial money for electricity in last year's supplemental, and there is a substantial amount of Iraqi funds that are going to electricity investment. I've actually been through many meetings, including several long ones when I visited Baghdad, precisely pressing the issue of, can't we get more electricity faster if we apply more money against it? And I would say now the Corps of Engineers, who are the main people in charge here, are pushing as fast as one reasonably can. And as I think you can understand, there are limits to how rapidly you can build up capacity. So I think the electricity one is actually not limited by dollars at all. At least I've been assured on that score with consistent pressing many times. On the security and law enforcement sector, which is another high priority and where we did not run into any of the issues that arose from the sort of large mega contracts, we did have one contracting problem, which is well publicized, where a contract was appealed and that caused some delay. I am impatient with any delays when it comes to equipping Iraqi security forces. There's no question that some of the problems we ran into in the last few weeks with police leaving their duty partly was the fact that they were outgunned, and so those are problems we can fix. And I think very substantial amounts are about to go into equipping those forces. General Petraeus is there now in charge of that effort, and I think we're really making a breakthrough. Some of the others are lagging, and I think some of it is probably because of fairly lengthy contracting procedures. But I think, again, we've been through many of those procedures by now, and I think that funding, for example, the real deficiencies, if you look at the report that we provide regularly to Congress, the April 23rd version, will show you that in things like road and bridge construction or water resources is where we have so far not spent very much, and we need to pick that up the pace there.
If I may, but the direct answer, whether it's Paul answering or me, is of course we're not satisfied. We've got a lot of reasons why some things aren't where we want them to be, and security is probably chief among them. But rather than just lay out excuses, we feel the same sense of urgency that Paul feels to get on with it. And when we go to Baghdad, as I and my colleagues have, just as when Paul goes, part of our time is spent with the PMO and with the USAID trying to push things out the door faster.
Appreciate that. I'll have some other questions on this. Mrs. Lowy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just briefly, before I get on to another question, following up on the Chairman's question, I would appreciate at some point if we could have further briefing regarding our interaction with the UN in the peacekeeping forces. And if, in fact, we expect to do any further work on that initiative in areas like Darfur, which you can question whether that's peacekeeping or not, or in areas such as the LRA in Uganda, where we've been working in southern Uganda, and we just let these people keep dying in northern Uganda. So at some point, I think it is worthy of further discussion as to how we train these forces, work with the UN, develop a Pan-African force, because we expect that in Darfur, in that whole area, over 1 million people are going to be dying. There isn't enough food, and I know we're working to get food into that area. So perhaps as we move on to other questions, we can reserve some time. I don't know if there'll be time in this hearing to focus on that issue. We will, of course,
endeavor to do that. But on Darfur, in Africa, which is in many ways a very sad place, and Darfur the saddest among them, we've had, I think, a real breakthrough. We finally got visas for USAID folks. We've finally got convoys of food going in that broke free yesterday. So, but the answer to your question is yes, ma'am, we'll do.
And the LRA has been continuing their killing now for about 18 years. So how we deal with the UN and how we train the forces and how we can be constructive in areas where it's clearly very complicated, I think would be helpful to us.
I'll make the arrangements.
But I do have one other question about that. It's my understanding that DOD had briefed certain committees of Congress with jurisdiction over DOD funding prior to sending the letter to us. Is it your intention to seek approval for these funds and new authorities through the Armed Services Committee or the DOD Appropriations Subcommittee, or the Foreign Operations Subcommittee? I asked for Secretary Wolfowitz's response.
It seems to me all the committees you just named have a voice in this issue, and it's not our position, I think, to decide who has jurisdiction. I apologize to Congressman Colby if, in fact, you first heard about it from the Washington Post. That shouldn't have happened, but we think this is an important initiative. It's to build capacity so that when there's a desire to accomplish something, whether it's in Darfur or somewhere else, that that capacity is there, and we don't automatically have to turn to American forces who have enormous stresses on them, as you know, today in all kinds of ways, and who often are far more capable than what is necessary for many of these missions. That's the spirit of it. We'd like to work with this subcommittee and with our Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, and this should be a joint effort between the executive branch and the Congress.
Thank you. Until very recently, the administration firmly insisted that enough funding had already been appropriated to prosecute the war in Iraq, and that any supplemental requests would be forthcoming only after the first of the year. However, in the last couple of weeks, we've heard that OMB is already at work on a potential supplemental request to get us through the end of the year, and there may be plans to authorize and appropriate between $25 billion and $50 billion in supplemental funds during the regular FY05 legislative process. For Secretary Wolfowitz, does DOD have enough money to carry out operations? In fact, there are several short questions. Maybe I should give them all to you. Do you have enough money to carry out operations in Iraq until the end of the calendar year? And if not, how much of a shortfall do you anticipate? And when will the administration request a supplemental for Iraq? And how much will be requested in this supplemental?
Some of these are questions we don't have any firm answers to right now. We are in the midst of what we call the mid-year execution review to see how we're doing on the estimates that we made, and we did estimate that we would have enough from the 04 supplemental to get us through fiscal year 04. With respect to fiscal year 05, which of course includes the last quarter of this calendar year, the anticipation has been that we would cash flow, as we say in the Defense Department, and spend out of accounts in anticipation of more precision in a supplemental. It's too early to say what the result of that mid-year execution review will be, because while we know that certain accounts are spending faster than anticipated, partly because of larger troop levels than anticipated, there are other accounts in our large budget that are underspending, and the question is how things net out. We will need some considerable amount of reprogramming authority from the Congress in order to make those accounts even out. That I think we're reasonably certain of.
Thank you very much. I guess my time is, unless you didn't use it this time.
No, I used it.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much.
Oh, Mr. Secretary
I don't know.
Armitage wants to respond.
I think that we've got a similar situation. OMB, as late as yesterday, told me their plans were still to seek a supplemental at the beginning of the next calendar year. But I'll be very frank with you, and I'm sure it's going on with Paul as well. We've got to be ready whenever an opportunity presents itself, and we've got some challenges out there in our little world, Liberia, Haiti, Sudan maybe, with God willing and all of that. And so at the first time there is talk of a supplemental, we'll be up here early and often. Regarding our ability in the State Department to take over the management of the new embassy and to be able to see our way clear, we're probably right now somewhere between $40 and $60 million short to get us through the end of the calendar year. I've got a strategy to whether I have to rob from Peter in my fiefdom and to pay Paul, or whether we go out and get agencies which will be serving with us and make them reimburse us, get them to reimburse us. I've got a strategy to get us into the calendar year. But it's going to take some flexibility and some work. It will not, as far as I know, take legislative relief yet, but it may.
Mr. Nolenberg.
Chairman, thank you very much, and gentlemen, both of you, we welcome you, appreciate your being here, appreciate everything that you're doing. I wanted to talk about Pakistan. I know that Secretary Armitage, you had something to do with kind of lowering the saber rattling a couple of years back, I guess it was, some months ago. And I noticed also that, in fact, that whole thing with India and Pakistan, I think, came to a simmer after having been pretty explosive by virtue of a lot of the work that you did, Secretary Armitage. I noticed also the budget for Pakistan is an increase, and we know why. There's things that are happening in Pakistan, and I know that President Musharraf's budget situation is a bit of a problem as well. Are you, and I'll defer to both of you, refer to both of you, and have you both respond if you would. Are you satisfied with the level of cooperation that we are getting out of Pakistan in terms of the war on terror and the whole business about stopping proliferation? And then also, are we getting the information that we really need from Mr. A.Q. Khan and his network? So if you respond, you can start, Secretary Armitage, and then we'll lead over to Secretary Wolfowitz. So if you would, please.
Thank you, Mr. Nolenberg. I've said time and again, and we'll repeat it here, that President Musharraf was the right man in the right place at the right time because of the way the whole war on terrorism unfolded. When you have as many as 70,000 of your forces up in an area in which Pakistani military forces never before participated, Waziristan, etc., that's a pretty big investment. And they lost some serious numbers of troops in that recent fight. I can cite for you, it's pretty publicly available, 550 terrorism suspects apprehended and a large number, which I won't mention here, which have been turned over to us and other interested, rendered to us and other interested parties. On the A.Q. Khan situation, I'll talk around it a little bit. We did have an opportunity in a closed briefing to brief some of the members here on this, CIA and I did. When we were finally able to approach the government of Pakistan with a full picture, once we had a full picture of the length and breadth and the tentacles of A.Q. Khan, how many countries they existed in, and just what they were doing, we could finally move forward with a full-up briefing for President Musharraf, and he moved immediately. And we have been, our intelligence agencies informed us that we are getting the cooperation we need. We in the State Department have sent our Assistant Secretary for Nonproliferation out to the various nations who are involved, and we've got excellent cooperation from them in wrapping up the various cells or entities or front organizations who are involved in A.Q. Khan. And now I'm not going to sit here and tell you we've got every one of them wrapped up, but it's going pretty well from my point of view. We're impatient, however, because of our fear in this global war on terrorism. We're impatient for even greater efforts from President Musharraf, and there's always a tension there. He's got a difficult management problem in his own country. I think he's managing it very well. It's the management problem of fighting with us on the war on terrorism and trying to work to continue to lower the temperature between India and Pakistan, and work particularly well with Prime Minister Vajpayee. So we are impatient, but from our point of view, we're pretty happy with what he's done.
Secretary Wolfowitz.
Yeah, I can second everything that Rich said, so I just add, I think, 3 brief comments. First of all, among the difficulties that Musharraf has to overcome in doing some of the pretty amazing things he's accomplished is that a lot of damage was done to our relationship over the previous decade of more or less isolating Pakistan, and we've had to work on rebuilding that, and I think with some considerable success. Second, among those people that have been captured in Pakistan, many of them actually who fled Afghanistan were later picked up in Pakistan, we've obtained some of the most valuable intelligence on terrorist plots against the United States and other countries, because there's some very big fish in that group. And finally, I would reinforce what Rich said. It was a very courageous action that they took up in the Waziristan province, and that is where we believe many of the top terrorists are now hiding out, and I think they're going to continue to be aggressive, and it's critical.
Yep. Thank you. I have just a moment or two left here, but I want to hit Iran in this same context. We know that Iran has a nuclear program, and we know also they don't want to give it up. They want it. And on this issue, Iran's actions stand in contrast to Libya. If we want to prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons, some pressure has to be applied, and you gentlemen would have a comment about that. In June, the IAEA Board of Governors will be meeting in Vienna. Is this an issue that should be sent to their attention?
Oh, this is an issue, Mr. Nollenberg, that is squarely for their attention. The cooperation or lack of cooperation which the IAEA inspectors are getting right now from Iran will force this to be an issue at the June Board of Governors meeting. The three primarily EU ministers representing France, the UK, and Germany have a lot invested in a successful outcome. We've worked very closely with them, and I've got a feeling that if the Iranians are not seen as forthcoming, they themselves will make sure it's an issue at the board meeting. And finally, there's been a shift, and it's not even a subtle shift, in European public attitudes toward the possibility of Iranian nuclear program, and they're getting concerned about it.
Thank you. I think my time has expired, has it not? I may come back with a final question on that subject. Thank you very much, Chairman.
Mr. Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, welcome. I have just a couple of questions, Mr. Wolfowitz, concerning Mr. Ahmed Chalabi. I'm wondering, did you place too much confidence in the Iraqi exiles before the conflict? And given Ahmed Chalabi's record and 40-year absence, I'm wondering why you found him to be a credible source.
There are a lot of premises in that question that aren't valid. If you're talking about his group and their role as a source for intelligence, you'd have to ask the CIA, because all of their intelligence was passed through either the DIA or other elements of the intelligence community. I think there's quite a bit of street legend out there that somehow he is the favorite of the Defense Department, and we had some idea of installing him as the leader of Iraq. He is one of many leaders of the Iraqi opposition with whom we have worked, we, the U.S. government, have worked closely over 2 administrations, May 3 actually. It started with the first President Bush. It includes the 2 very courageous leaders of the Kurdish groups who are sometimes bizarrely referred to as externals, even though they've spent the last 40 years in Iraq, much of it under Saddam Hussein. I'm referring to Masoud Barzani and Jalal Talabani. There's the Iraqi National Accord led by Mr. Iyad Alawi. There is the Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolution in Iraq that was led by the late Mohammed Bakr al-Hakim, who was brutally murdered in the bombing in Najaf. Our strategy has to be to work with as many different elements of Iraqi leadership as we can find, and we've been working very hard to find leaders from inside Iraq, people who did not spend all their time in exile, although I think it's a real disservice to dismiss people who fought sometimes inside Iraq quite bravely against Saddam as, quote, mere exiles. Charles de Gaulle was an exile. The basic point is we don't have favorites. We shouldn't have favorites. What we want to set up is a process, and Mr. Brahimi is helping us to do this, that will produce a government that is eventually an elected government that's the choice of the Iraqi people, not the choice of the United States or the United Nations or any foreign entity.
Mr. Secretary, in an interview recently with the London Telegraph, Mr. Chalabi said that he and his group, and I quote, were heroes in error, and I quote, what was said before is not important. On 60 Minutes, he pinned the blame on the administration for believing the information he provided, and I quote, intelligence people who are supposed to do a better job for their country and their government did not do such a good job, end quote. Why is the department still paying Mr. Chalabi's group $340,000 a month? And for $340,000 a month, what is he doing? Is there any truth to that number, by the way? It's widely
Jackson,
reported.
I'm not certain what is classified and what is unclassified here. We are getting certainly into the area of very sensitive intelligence collection that's going on. We're paying many groups in Iraq for intelligence. Intelligence is a vital part of this war. I'd be happy to come up here with a classified briefing because I think it's a very important subject. I can't answer for Mr. Chalabi's comments in the press or elsewhere. You'd have to ask him.
But you can
We
certainly
work
answer.
very hard. We work very hard to vet. Our intelligence community works very hard to vet its sources to try to figure out who's telling us the truth and who's selling us stuff for money or telling us stuff they think we want to hear or telling us stuff they want us to hear. It's a very difficult world out there. I'm talking to generals in the field who are on a daily basis trying to sort out the wheat from the chaff, the true from the false, because soldiers' lives depend on it. But we are getting some extremely valuable information from a whole range of Iraqi groups, including Mr. Chalabi's, and we need to figure out how to get the best available to us.
Mr. Secretary, I appreciate you acknowledging that our brave men and women in the field rely upon good intelligence. According to Knight Ridder, Mr. Chalabi may have, and I quote, violated restrictions against using taxpayer funds to lobby when it campaigned for U.S. action to oust Saddam Hussein. The White House cited that Chalabi's group fabricated stories about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and its rationale for going to war. Thus, if the allegation is true, it means that U.S. taxpayer funds paid themselves to be persuaded that it was necessary to invade Iraq, which put U.S. men and women at risk. Would you care to comment on that?
As to the question of lobbying, I think that's something that the State Department and IG investigated. I believe Rich might have a further comment to add. We are looking very carefully at the whole issue of the intelligence that led up to the war. I think you're talking about one particular scrap of it. There are many other pieces. That's what the Silberman-Robb Commission is going to be looking into. I'm sure this is one of those many things. But to the best of my knowledge, the one piece of information that's referred to is a single piece, and it's a much, much bigger picture. And we still haven't gotten to ground truth as to what the situation is in Iraq. We continue to learn more about what they had and what might have happened to it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Did you want to add anything, Secretary?
Just that there was a GAO investigation ordered by the Congress. It was not specifically on the question of lobbying. It was more generally on the use of funds. We at the State Department had some, well, having for years a fairly close relationship with the INC and others. At one point in time, we had some difficulty getting receipts, et cetera, and that precipitated an IG investigation. But in both the GAO and the IG investigation were relatively inconclusive, though clearly the paper trail was not as it should be. However, we're not looking at the question of illegal lobbying, to my knowledge.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to respond to that only because before the war, Mr. Chalabi was a regular on Capitol Hill. He was a regular in meetings with members of Congress. Spent a considerable amount of his time on Capitol Hill making the case for the action. And so lobbying should be part of the questions that should be asked by your review panel or by the IG with respect to these funds. And so if we can count, Mr. Chairman, on a response, in part because I indicated in my question, which is widely known, I mean, this isn't some intelligence briefing that I participated in, that the Department of Defense is still paying Mr. Chalabi $340,000, and that there have been an unbroken continuity of those payments even before the conflict. And so this is an important question that we seek the answer to. Thank you.
Mr. Lewis.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I began to get to know Secretary Wolfowitz as a result of he and I traveling together at the time the Philippines was seeking a pathway to democracy, and I began to appreciate not only his capability but his commitment to the development of freedom in many places in the world on that trip. The Secretary, in my judgment, was one of the very early people who imagined the possibility that in the war on terrorism that just perhaps in Iraq we could have a very unusual opportunity. That is to remove a terrorist regime that had been terrorizing its own people for decades, had carried forward actions against its own people that absolutely rival the days of Hitler and Stalin, and indeed who recognized that if we are successful in Iraq, putting that country on a pathway with a hope for freedom, a hope for their own governance, other than arbitrary rule, that it could provide a model in the Middle East that could indeed perhaps save tens of thousands of lives over time and multiple billions of dollars. With that, however, Secretary Wolfowitz, we're presently just approaching June 30, '04, when we will be transferring a thing called sovereignty to the Iraqi people. In my contact there, those representatives from the coalition of provisional authority that hopes to lead this pathway we're talking about, there have been constant expressions to many of us that they're very concerned about getting us out as quickly as possible, and at the same time very concerned about our staying long enough to have the stability and security that will allow them to make real progress as they try to really develop a form of government some 1 year later. It's my impression that the American people have the impression, and many in Congress have the impression, that we are going to be leaving Iraq on June 30th, that some way 130,000 people will be, troops will be coming back home that day almost. It's very important that we clear the air regarding that question. Would you respond to that question for the committee, and maybe even, since there's television around, the public might begin to hear that we may be there longer?
Mr. Lewis, I appreciate the opportunity because I think it's very important. We will have exactly as many troops in Iraq on July 1st as we have on June 30th. The status of the Iraqi government at that point will be different, although under the UN Security Council Resolution 1511, we will still be in charge of the multinational force, of which Iraqis are a part, by the way. In fact, the Iraqis are now, along with us, the two largest components of security forces, and Iraqis are fighting and dying every day. Over 300 of them have given their lives in the line of duty since a year ago, and another, I think 7 were killed yesterday in an attack on an Iraqi police station in Mosul. The key going forward is for us to be there until the Iraqis can really provide for their own security. We're a long way from that, although I would submit that we're making very rapid progress, and part of that progress comes from the supplemental money that the Congress provided to equip and train Iraqi security forces. But to come back again, we plan to be there as long as we're needed, and we're certainly going to be needed on July 1st. We'll be there in very substantial numbers. Our goal is to have Iraqis increasingly assume a role for their own security, but not to abandon them. And I think it's important to make that very clear, because it's easy, especially for people who aren't lawyers, to not fully understand what sovereignty means. Let me give you an example. We transferred sovereignty to Afghanistan in December of 2001. Afghanistan has had a sovereign government under the bond process, which was actually authored by Mr. Brahimi, since December 2001. They are going through the various stages of that bond process. Throughout that whole period, the United States is in Afghanistan, as everyone knows, performing fundamental security functions.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, you've expressed concern about the conflict that kind of exists out there between the responsibility of this subcommittee and the Defense Department's responsibility. I note that General Walters is in the audience, who's kind of responsible within the department for overseeing some of those conflicted funds. I mean, I would hope that the departments on both sides would know that this committee does expect to have consultation and communication regarding the way those funds are being handled. There's a very unusual circumstance with this war, especially in Iraq, but in the region. But the committee still needs input on a regular basis, and I'd urge you to recognize the importance of that. If I could, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to raise one other point briefly and hope maybe other members might follow on with me in pursuit of this. Secretary Armitage, as well as Secretary Wolfowitz, I am most concerned about information that's come forth regarding what was described as the Oil for Food program. That program, which essentially was recognizing stress on average Iraqis because of sanctions we had rightly placed against Saddam Hussein's regime. And in the meantime, to sell oil to bring food to children, it's very apparent that the scandal underlying that, where the food money was used for golden palaces and any number of, and variety and mix of Saddam Hussein's wishes, creates an environment in which questions are raised about the UN, the State Department's oversight, indeed the role that the department may have played in connection with those money flows. Could you respond, please, Mr. Secretary, regarding oil for something other than food and the UN's role here?
I think, yes, sir. I think the Oil for Food program, in Iraqis' eyes, was always very suspect. In fact, it's one of the things I think that makes some Iraqis catch their breath when you say the United Nations, because they have the image of people siphoning off at least a certain amount of the funds or having kickbacks or whatever way you want to describe it. The UN is involved in an investigation of this. I know for our part, we have gotten permission to provide, I believe it was to the FRC, the documents they requested in this regard. It was rather extraordinary for us to do that because we want to get to the bottom of it just as much as you do. And if someone's guilty, they ought to hang. So.
Thank you very much. Ms. Capter.
I think it has huge
Excuse me.
ramifications. It's not only a matter of money being basically stolen from the Iraqi people. Money went into the accounts of Saddam and his cronies that was not supposed to go there, and there's every reason to think that some of it was used to buy influence with Middle Eastern media, with a whole variety of recipients of that money. It was a money laundering operation that was designed to buy influence, it appears to me.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Capter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. Welcome, gentlemen. I take it this budget request is about 20% over last year's request, about $6 billion or so. Would you estimate that's correct?
About that,
Thank you. Could you estimate approximately how much the Department of State and the Department of Defense are spending on a monthly basis for the Iraqi operation? Just ballpark, total.
Ballpark is, the most recent estimate I was given was $4.7 billion a month. It is, prior to this month, I would have said the average was going to go down because some of that includes one-time expenditures made at the beginning of the year. On the other hand, expenditures this month have been higher than we anticipated. So that's part of this mid-year execution review, is try to get a better fix on it.
So that's about $60 billion a year on the defense side. What about the state side?
I'm just doing my sums here.
Thank you.
It looks to me, if I added right, basically April to June, the State Department is spending about $213 or so million, and from July to September of this year, that is to the end of the fiscal year, we're looking at spending about 380 or so more, for a total of $580 million in that time frame. I can't be more precise than that.
So we're somewhere over $60 billion a year for both, not counting supplementals that might be sent up here later. Am I correct?
Well, the Department of State monies, ma'am, would be considerably less than that, considering state operations and even eventually building embassies. That's could be no more than $1 billion a year for the operations side, and perhaps $1 billion to $1.5 billion for the building side.
But adding that to $5 billion a month on the defense side is what I'm saying, Mr. Secretary. You know, so we're somewhere over $60 billion a year at this point. I just wanted to report to you, and I know Secretary Armitage's service in the military, for which we thank you very much. I wanted to alert you to the fact that the 2nd Army Cavalry Regiment attached to 1st Armored Division K Troop that fought outside of Najaf this week still does not have doors on its Humvees. And I would like to ask at this point how many Americans have been killed in Iraq. You mentioned the Iraqi police. What is the total number now of Americans that have been killed in Iraq?
It's approximately 500, of which I can get to the exact numbers. Approximately 350 are combat deaths.
And do we know how many of those were killed in Humvees without doors? It's a substantial number.
A very substantial effort, Ms. Capter, has gone into a whole variety of force protection measures, including providing up-armored Humvees at the most rapid rate we can produce them. And we are doing everything we can, and people are working night and day to try to make sure that those troops have the best possible protection. There is nothing that guarantees protection, as I think you know.
Well, sir, I can guarantee you that some of the Marines that fought in Najaf this week did not have Humvees with doors. And I think if we have Humvees that are armored, that are back in supply areas or whatever, they should be brought up to the front.
That has been done.
I thank you for, it was not done this week. Secretary Armitage, would you clarify the role of Saddam Hussein on 9/11, please? What role did he play?
I know of no role of Saddam Hussein in 9/11. Our president has said that, and I know of nothing.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, who is the chief, Secretary Wolfowitz, who's the chief architect in the Bush administration for the plan for the governance of Iraq, currently and after June 30th? Who's the chief architect? Who do we go to if we have a question?
For about the last year, the person in charge has been Ambassador Jerry Bremer, L. Paul Bremer, who is head of the Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq, who has extraordinary authority under presidential letter and as the head of the Occupation Authority.
All right. In his position, would he know how much money the Coalition of the Willing is paying on an annual basis? Who would we go to if we're paying over $61 billion plus annually for the operation in Iraq? How much is the Coalition of the Willing paying?
I will, through our Political Military Affairs Bureau, provide that for you. I think you want, if I may, two things. How much money have countries who are in the Coalition of the Willing pledged to the reconstruction of Iraq, plus how much money are they paying to support their own forces who are serving alongside us? I'll provide both of those.
I thank you, Mr. Secretary, very much. Secretary Wolfowitz, you said prior to the war that oil revenues would offset, they would be sufficient to meet our costs. Could you please explain to us how much oil revenues are offsetting these costs at the current point at which we are at?
I didn't say that, Congressman Cafter. What I said was that unlike Afghanistan, which has no sources of income, Iraq has potentially very large sources of revenue in the form of oil revenues. And I also said we have no way at that point of estimating what the needs would be. The needs, in fact, have turned out, if anything, to be even larger than one might have anticipated. But I believe the estimate, I will get you a precise number, but the oil revenues have actually started to come in at a higher level than we projected at this point, and the oil revenues for this year are going to be very substantial. In the fiscal year, calendar year 04, and I will check this precisely for the record, approximately $20 billion in Iraqi resources are being applied to the reconstruction of that country, a combination of leftover oil for food revenues and something on the order, I believe, of $14 billion in oil. I'll try to check that before this hearing ends.
Well, Mr. Secretary, I just want to place on the record, if I could, Mr. Chairman, I will end with this. Your quote up on Capitol Hill last year where you said there's a lot of money to pay for this. You meant the invasion of Iraq. It doesn't have to be U.S. taxpayer money. We are dealing with a country that can really finance its own reconstruction and relatively soon. You told Congress oil revenues of Iraq could bring between 50 and 100 billion over the course of the next 2 or 3 years. We're dealing with a country that can really finance its own reconstruction and relatively soon. I end the quote, and I know we'll have a second round, and my time has expired.
I just want to say, I specifically said in the part you didn't quote, compared to Afghanistan, which has no resources and will be has the potential of being a permanent war to the international community, that Iraq can contribute substantially. And I would say that, in fact, $15 billion in this year, when the war is still continuing, the enemy is still sabotaging oil facilities, is a substantial contribution.
Thank you. Mr. Kirk.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just note that, Secretary, you and I worked with the Iraqi opposition for 15 years. I remember when President Clinton signed the Iraq Liberation Act saying it's the policy of the United States to replace Saddam Hussein's government. And we were disappointed that the opposition, all of the opposition, only got a couple of fax machines and desks to fight Saddam Hussein. I always been a close watcher of the opposition, and it seemed clear to me that President Clinton and I think this administration actually liked the Iraqi National Accord. That seemed to be always my read on who the favorite opposition group is. Chalabi always got himself in trouble in the press, and it was Yad Alawi and the INA that always seemed to be the American favorite to me. But that being said, I want to switch to another topic. It seems we've made a decision over the last 2 years as a people that despite the threat of terror, we're going to maintain an open society. And if you keep an open society, then the only real way to provide security for Americans is to go on offense against terrorists so that we do not fear them, but they fear us. We agree in that as we attack terrorists, they are going to change their tactics, and we need to adapt to their changes. It's clear to me from a recent mission I conducted in Afghanistan and Pakistan that Osama bin Laden's access to foreign funds is declining very quickly because of the United Nations and global coalition effort against him, and that he's increasingly relying on heroin sales to fund al-Qaeda. I was concerned about boosting cooperation between state, INL, and the Drug Enforcement Agency. I think that's going on. But I'm also concerned about DOD cooperation in the anti-narcotic effort because of its nexus to funding terror. This committee, Congress, provided $73 million for the DOD anti-narcotic effort in Afghanistan. I heard from our commanders at CTF 180, which is the command in Afghanistan, that 3 key terror groups in Afghanistan, the HIG, the Taliban, and al-Qaeda, are now largely dependent on heroin sales to fund their operations. Can you talk about DOD's reluctance to get into the narco-terrorist game, but maybe where you're going with overall?
Okay, I don't think, we don't feel reluctant. If I could pick up on what you said at the beginning, too. I mean, there may well be some individuals or even agencies that favor the INA. I go back to what I said earlier. I think it's a mistake for the United States to have favorites in Iraq. There's some courageous people in the INA. There are courageous people in the INC. I think one can't help but be impressed by what the 2 main Kurdish groups have accomplished over the years. And though I never met him before last October, I must say there was a lot in Mr. Hakim that I found impressive. I go back. Our point should be to support any Iraqis who commit themselves to the idea of a free and representative government in that country. I think it's a shame in a way that we didn't give more support to them over the previous decade and got to the point where the situation was so threatening we had to do it with our own troops.
I have a personal favorite, too. I think Jalal Talabani in the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan has been amazing. So, and
I try not to have favorites, but I appreciate your high regard for them. We regard the heroin business in Afghanistan as extremely important to us. I don't mean to trivialize the importance of the heroin when it arrives in Europe, but we're concerned, as you are, about it becoming a source of funds both for terrorists and for warlords who will oppose the effort, quite impressive effort so far by Mr. Karzai to create a substantial Afghan national government. Partly because of the European interest in the heroin that gets shipped to Europe, the UK has got the international lead for that. And as you know, in our government, State Department has the lead for counter-narcotics. But we are committed to making maximum use of the $73 million that Congress has granted us, specifically to provide equipment to the Afghan counter-narcotics force that the British are training, to improve the equipping and operations of the Afghan police, to establish border entry points, to develop a counter-narcotics intelligence fusion center, and to assist them with a public affairs capability.
Prime Minister Blair has said that Britain will lead on the fight against heroin in Afghanistan. You hear from the British a lot of hope that the U.S. military will provide helicopter support to the British effort there. There's some tension there in Kabul, so I hope you can take that back for action and look into it, because they've raised that with us.
Okay.
Yeah.
The word is action.
Right. One last question. When you meet with CTF 180, our command in Kabul, they'll give you a chart, and it compares rebuilding the Afghan army to the Iraqi army to show the difficulties in rebuilding the Afghan army. In Iraq, they say we have a society with an industrial base. In Afghanistan, it's all agrarian. In Iraq, we have a national infrastructure. In Afghanistan, none. Defense infrastructure in Iraq, nothing in Afghanistan. Defense institutions in Iraq, nothing in Afghanistan. Troop training in Iraq is under a U.S. contract. In Afghanistan, it's through an Afghan cadre. We have 27 battalions for Iraq, just 15 for Afghanistan. In Iraq, we're funded with $1.7 billion of DOD Title X money, all coming from a clear chain of command. In Afghanistan, just $569 million, all in foreign assistance and coalition. I'm worried because the Iraq forces record over the last month hasn't been too good. And it was the better funded, better commanded and administered organization than what the Afghans are getting. But can you give me your assessment of how we're building this Afghan army to help us in the hunt for Osama bin Laden?
Of course, they're facing different enemies, and I would say the enemy in Iraq at the moment is more formidable. It's remnants of a very, very tough regime combined with Mr. Zarqawi, who is a real world-class terrorist. Just look at the level of suicide bombings, I mean, relatively speaking. I think it's important. It's less a matter of relative. In both cases, we're trying to push as fast as the capacity of those countries will sustain. We were under no illusions that some 200,000, if you count every single component of the Iraqi security forces, were ready to meet the kind of challenge that they faced this month. In fact, the target for getting most of those forces trained and equipped was the fall to the end of this year. And I would say the performance has been mixed. I mean, if you had said it was good, then I would say there were a lot of disappointments. Since you've said it's generally bad, I have to say there's some places where it was very, very good. In fact, the 36th Battalion of the Iraqi Civil Defense Corps, which is made up of elements of exactly those 5 groups that you and I have just been mentioning, right. INC, the INA, PUK, the KDP, and Skiri, fought extremely well for a period of time in this tough fighting in Fallujah. And in places like Mosul, for example, when the police station in this government building was attacked, the governor, who's a Sunni Arab, by the way, stayed there through the night and they fought off the attack. So it's uneven. One of the things that clearly is needed in Iraq is a much higher level of equipment. I think in Afghanistan, our challenges so far have not been so much in the equipping as in the recruiting and retention. And often we get recruits, at least initially, I think we've fixed this problem, but we were getting recruits who were sort of offered by local warlords, and after they'd been through the training, they went back home. I just wouldn't compare the two situations except to say that in both cases, the key to success, the key to getting our troops home is to get Afghans and Iraqis fighting for their own country. And I think in both cases, there are plenty of them who are ready to do it.
I think the chairman has led us in providing substantially more resources for Afghanistan than the administration. I hope we continue that trend. But thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kirk. We'll begin a second round of questioning here. Mr. Secretary Wolfowitz, let me go back to to Iraq and the contract issues there. I'm sure you're familiar with the draft GAO report that describes several contracts issued by the Department of Defense having been awarded without full and open competition. Says sometimes that was done with justification, but sometimes without. This subcommittee was fairly clear in the supplemental appropriation that we, to the extent possible, wanted full and open competition, not only because we think not only because it's the law, but not only because it's the right way to do it, but also because it has to do with the credibility, I think, of the contracts. A lot of these have to do with the security, logistical support for training the Iraqi armed forces. Can you tell us what steps the department is taking to ensure that future contracts or task orders are well defined and managed, as well as being awarded under conditions of full and open competition?
We've established a program management office in Baghdad under the direction of retired Admiral Nash, who's a real expert in the contracting field. He's put together a team with incredible speed to deal with a very large task, as you know. We concluded, and Secretary Armitage participated in this a few months ago, that the task itself really was beyond the capacity of any office we could put together in Baghdad, and that there needed to be some support from back here, and the Army stepped up, and I think it's very much mutual agreement between state and defense. This is not a matter of the Army taking something over from anybody, but the Army providing a capacity to execute large contracts that very few other agencies of the government have. I believe that everything we're doing under the supplemental has been subjected to full and open competition. The Congress did give us some waiver authority, and if we need it, we will come and consult with you before we use it.
Mr. Chairman, you're going to be meeting with John Negroponte shortly, I know. I talked to John this morning. The PMO, so-called PMO, no matter what it ultimately is called, will be under the Chief of Missions guidance. And John will tell you that you're going to have fair, open, transparent contracting procedures. As soon as he steps in, the situation is not where it was 6 and 8 months ago when we started this, but I think he will make you feel quite comfortable in this regard.
Secretary Armitage, let me turn to the issue of the transition, since you mentioned Ambassador Negroponte. Here, we're about to go 64 days, I guess it is, that the Coalition Provisional Authority, the CPA, will cease to exist, and there will be a sovereign government in Iraq, and our operation there, now headed by Ambassador Bremer, will, of course, fall to Ambassador to Iraq, John Negroponte. The Special Advisor to the UN Secretary General, Mr. Brahimi, has recently outlined his proposals for the Iraqi caretaker government, and that includes elections in January of 2005. He noted in outlining these provisions that, quote, the security situation above all else was and remains extremely worrying, unquote. So let me just ask you a couple of, he also said that the CPA is considering the dissolution of existing militias. Let me ask you, has the current security situation in Iraq prompted the administration to reconsider the date on which sovereignty might be? No. Do you think the security environment in Iraq affects Brahimi's recommendations, particularly as regards elections?
It is his present intention is that we will press ahead for January 2005 national elections for National Assembly, or whatever they choose to call it. He is going back, perhaps as early as Sunday night or Monday, to spend the first 2 weeks in Baghdad and beyond, consulting with Iraqis about a variety of names to put forward to form a caretaker government. And I'll get back to that in a minute. The second 2 weeks, it is, as I understand it, Mr. Brahimi's intention to spend going around Iraq trying to get consensus buy-in on a series of names that might serve in the function of president, 2 vice presidents, prime minister, and a technocrat cabinet. Now, the reason I mention this as a caretaker cabinet is related to the question of sovereignty. This will be a sovereign government. Now, every government, including our own, has limits on our sovereignty. We limit ourselves. We self-limit by laws or international conventions and things of that nature. And indeed, this government, in Mr. Brahimi's concept, this caretaker government, should not involve itself in decisions which would take place over the long term. That should be done by democratically elected government. So it will be a sovereign government, but there are limits, as I've just described.
Mr. Chairman, could I?
Yes, of course.
Could I just add one point on your question about should things be delayed? From the point of view of our military and from the point of view of the security situation, it's very important to proceed with that transfer. I guess I try to describe it simply as this. The enemy we're confronting is a ruthless enemy, a very dangerous enemy that just recently murdered and mutilated one of the members of the Baghdad City Council. They're going after people who cooperate with us. They can threaten the most severe punishments, but they offer no vision, no positive vision. We need to make sure the Iraqis see a positive vision connected with us to maintain what General Abizaid calls consent in competing for that large mass of the Iraqi people who have no love of Saddam Hussein, no desire to be ruled by terrorists or by former Saddam elements. It is very important that we keep that positive vision forward, and part of it is to assure them that they are going to have their own country back. They are going to be governing themselves.
My time is up on this second round, and I quite agree with you, Secretary Wolfowitz, but that's a matter of worry, I think, to a lot of us, because I noticed the most recent polling data that has been done, and there is polling data coming from Iraq, shows a very dramatic slippage of the number of Iraqis that now believe that we were there as liberators. It's now 71% that believe that we're occupiers of the country. So that positive vision is going to be a hard one to communicate, isn't it?
You're absolutely right, but that's a reason to stop being the occupying authority and have Iraqis be the government.
Thank you, Ms. Lowy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There was an article today in the New York Times with reference to Fallujah, and it seems to be very confusing, and I wondered if you can clarify for us. Part of the article says, in a reported deal intended to end the standoff between insurgents in Fallujah and American troops, a new Iraqi security force comprising former Iraqi soldiers and commanders will replace the American forces encircling the city and assume responsibility for pacifying the resistance. Then it says, an unnamed senior American official told CNN today that no such deal had been finalized. Could you clarify what is happening in Fallujah?
Probably not, because it's a confusing situation. A lot of conversations are going on, led by both our military and the CPA and the Iraqi Governing Council, with a variety of people from Fallujah who may or may not represent real groups. But I think we've had some success over the last few days in basically trying to separate those citizens of Fallujah that would like to see peace restored and get on with their lives, and that relatively small number, but large enough to be very significant problem of real killers. And the goal has got to be to try to isolate the killers from the population so that if military action is necessary, it can be done with a minimum of civilian casualties.
Ms. Lowy, may I? It's very important for the United States, for both the U.S. Marine Corps, who's in Fallujah, around Fallujah, and for the CPA, of which State Department employees are certainly taking part in these discussions, to be seen as trying, to the extent possible, resolve this thing politically. I personally don't think ultimately it will entirely be resolved that way, but it's very important in the region and in Iraq to be seen as not having collective punishment for something that some killers in Fallujah did. And so it's a very important endeavor that the military and the CPA is engaged in.
Thank you. So no deal has been finalized at this point, and you're still working on it?
That's correct.
Just to pursue the chairman's questions on the Iraqi transition, given the fact that the Iraqi Governing Council has had a prominent role in Iraq with our endorsement, how practical is it to expect that none of them will be part of the transitional government?
I suspect that some of them will. It will be a function of a lot of things. I think technical expertise, the standing or the feeling in which the Iraqi people hold for these various people. But I kind of endorse the direction of your statement. It would be unreasonable to expect none of them. Because after all, the Iraqi Governing Council has all along been beginning, and some of them faster than others, performing the duties of a government and performing the duties of ministries. There's a certain level of expertise there that can't be overlooked.
Do you agree with Envoy Brahimi that Ahmed Chalabi should not be part of the transition government?
My own view is that Mr. Brahimi will be consulting widely with the people of Iraq, and he'll be guided in the main by that.
And given the fact that the soonest elections can take place in Iraq, you said, as early 2005, the transitional government will be in control for at least 18 months. So it seems naive or very difficult to succeed that this team of non-political technocrats can control Iraq and avoid partisan activity. It is also unclear to me how they will govern if they don't control the security forces. Can you explain to me how this works?
Yes, first of all, the January 2005 would be approximately 7 months, 7+ months, that a caretaker government would be in charge, after which elections for a National Assembly would take place, and they would appoint the government. So it's 7 months. But I think the question of how a government which doesn't actually control the military can be seen as sovereign, or how it will work, you might look to, well, Afghanistan is one that Paul's mentioned. I'll mention a very great success story of all of ours, and that's the Republic of Korea, where for years Korean forces were under U.S. And UN command without any denigration of sovereignty. So it can work, and one of the things that we'll be trying to do, notwithstanding our view that UN Security Council Resolution 1511 gives us the authority to continue in a security role in Iraq, will be most probably, and I'd say very probably, seeking a UN Security Council, new UN Security Council resolution, one of the elements of which would be to enshrine the fact that coalition forces and Iraqi forces would cooperate in a certain manner.
And also following up, the state, you have provided us with unofficial estimates of the cost of operating our embassy for the next 18 months. Without counting potential construction, the costs are estimated at $1.5 billion, of which only about $500 million is currently available. Could you give us an idea how you intend to fund the remaining billion needed to operate the embassy? Will you seek supplemental funding? Where will you get the dollars?
We will certainly, when a supplemental comes forward, seek supplemental funding in the CJS side of the House for the operating funds. I mentioned earlier, I think in response to the chairman's question, we've got several funding strategies to try to bridge the shortfall until we could have a supplemental. One would be to get agencies to reimburse us for their presence at the embassy, or as I said, an unpopular one, but one that I'm willing to do, is to shift the department's resources with the proper permissions from the Congress. There are also some other questions about whether or not we could use some of the 10% money in the IRRF to put towards state ops. So we've got a bunch of strategies. And finally, I'm not happy with the numbers. We provide you those numbers, and best I can do, but we're squeezing them down about every day, and I would hope we could squeeze a little more of the fat out of them, get them a little leaner.
I guess I'm out of time, but at some point, I think it would be helpful to both of us if we can get a better handle, even though you're here together and you're saying everything is hunky-dory, who's really going to control these funds? There's a lot of money, a lot of taxpayer dollars here, and who's going to be in charge? But I know I'm out of time, right? Right. So we can continue at another point.
Chairman, thank you. And let me go back to that question I had with you, Secretary Armitage, that had to do with the representation, or whether we should refer this problem of Iran to the IAEA. What I really wanted to make sure about and to clarify, do you also recommend that we do something about directing it to the UN Security Council? You may have answered. I didn't think I got the.
No, I didn't answer that. I
Yeah.
I didn't mention the Security Council. I didn't hear you mention it in your question.
I don't think
but,
I did. That's what
out of the IAEA Board of Governors, one of the things they could do is refer this to the UN Security Council. In fact, that the threat of reference to the UN Security Council is one of the biggest sticks I think the IAEA has over the Iranian program right now. The IAEA is in their investigatory phase. I'm very suspicious and skeptical, and it's not a state secret, but we'll wait till they come forward and finish it, and we'll see where we go. I can't commit to going to the Security Council absent knowing what the IAEA report is going to look like. If they came out saying things are pretty good and heading in the right direction, it would be difficult, I think, to get the momentum to go to the Security Council. If, on the other hand, they can say they were stonewalled or they didn't get the cooperation, it's a lot easier call.
Thank you. Let me go to a question about the latest, the Israel's disengagement plan, and I know that people have different views on this, but it is another idea, and it's one we should obviously investigate every idea, and this is one I think that provides some opportunity potentially for progress. This probably is more of Secretary Armitage's dominion, but again, Secretary Wolfowitz, if you want to jump in somewhere. There's some significant risks that are involved here, obviously. One of the big questions is what's going to happen to Gaza after the Israelis leave? And somebody's got to get a grip on Gaza, because without some international cooperation, I think that with a vacuum, it's going to cede to the Hamas, and I guess in some respects they're already making some overtures that way. So what needs to happen, in your judgment, to prevent Hamas from becoming the ruling authority in Gaza? And by the way, just what would America's role be, and what maybe is like Egypt's role, because they share a border with Gaza, and so on those two counts, if you would.
Sure. There's been an awful lot of talk since 1967 about a resolution of the question of the Palestinians. For the first time, we see the possibility that settlements will actually be turned over to the Palestinians, 21 of them in Gaza and 4 in the West Bank. That for the first time since 1967, Palestinians will have access to an Arab country directly. There are a lot of positive elements in this. There's not going to be an immediate vacuum because the evacuation or the leaving of Gaza by the Israelis is supposed to happen over roughly a year or a little more, while international institutions and hopefully the World Bank and others come in to try to preserve the settlements and sort of work on infrastructure and development, etc. The single biggest issue, in my view, is to have our Egyptian friends step up very strongly and resolutely on the question of the Philadelphia Strip between Gaza and Egypt, one that is now patrolled, even with difficulty, by the Israelis. If they can stop that as a route for weapons, etc., then there's a fair chance that Hamas can be starved from weaponry. But I think you have to look at the Palestinian Authority. They have not yet proven in any way, shape, or form capable of being the entity that actually can live up to any of the aspirations of the Palestinian people. And I hope that won't always be the case, and certainly there are very capable people in the PA. Now, I'm not going to make the mistake I think we made before of embracing any particular person. Abu Mazen previously was actually a pretty good guy, and I think we perhaps hugged him a little close. So we'll work with the Palestinian Authority as appropriate. But the single biggest issue is stopping any infiltration.
Do you think there should be an international presence of some kind?
I'm not very enthusiastic about it.
I guess we can't be too enthusiastic about a lot of things, but it seems like that whole situation is a bit of a problem. It will create, I think, some heartburn and headache for a number of people, but a number of countries too. And so,
but that argument, sir, about the first time that things have really changed and settlements are being turned over, or at least could be turned over, is a real one, and I'm not going to sit here and try to give you a bunch of eyewash that all our friends in the Arab world are really behind this. They're not, but they do see some positive elements. The foreign minister of Qatar the other day stood in front of the department and said he saw positive elements in this plan. The King of Bahrain put out a positive statement after I was there. So there's enough to work with here. And if we can get the Arab states to step up and appropriately support the Palestinians in Gaza, then they'll be a lot farther down the way.
Is there encouragement within the or among the Arab nations to take some position on this, or at least react? Not necessarily by us, but by anybody. He said this one comment came.
Well, there have been a couple of comments. There's also negative comments, and in my recent trip through the region, I was able to have discussions with all the leadership about just the positive elements of the plan. I'm not, and I won't speak to the motives of the government of Israel. Just say we have to seize the moment, and perhaps Palestinians can prove they are capable of providing for their own future in a better way. And that's we're concentrating on that. We're telling our Arab friends that, and they're not all buying it, but some are to some extent.
Thank you. Thank you. Secretary Wolfowitz, would you have any interest in making a comment regarding?
Nothing to add, except that I do think progress on this front is important to us throughout the Middle East, including in Iraq. And as Mr. Armitage said, there is some real progress here for the first time in decades, and that's not a bad thing.
One of the things, I guess my time has expired, but thank you all. Thank you both very, very much.
Thank you, Mr. Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, once again. And Secretary Armitage, a few moments ago, you were asked a question by Congresswoman Capter about the role that Saddam Hussein had played in 9/11, and you said that there was no role. I thought
I knew of no role.
I thought that was clear. The stenographer clearly has the record. But I want to ask a question of, maybe two questions of Mr. Wolfowitz, but let me premise it with some source data. In a world transformed, former President Bush and former National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft said that, and I quote, "Trying to eliminate Saddam, extending the ground war into an occupation of Iraq would have violated our guideline about not changing objectives in midstream, engaging in mission creep, and would have incurred incalculable human and political cost." During that period since that event, we maintained a no-fly zone and an embargo policy with respect to Iraq, and so there was already a mission, a military mission taking place in Iraq. in 1991, and it's a continuous mission since the first Gulf War, I might add. There's no unbroken continuity in our involvement since 1991 in Iraq. Oftentimes, these committees fail to acknowledge that we've had a long military and policy in Iraq since the first war. In a 1991 speech, then Secretary of Defense, the Vice President, argued, "I think that the proposition of going to Baghdad is also fallacious. I think that if we're going to remove Saddam Hussein, we would have had to go all the way to Baghdad. We would have had to commit a lot of force. And once we'd done that, we'd gotten rid of Saddam Hussein and his government, then we'd have to put another government in its place. It would have been a mistake for us to get bogged down in that quagmire inside Iraq." And then as Undersecretary of Defense and Policy under Mr. Cheney, Mr. Deputy Secretary was in a crucial position to influence the decision when and how to cease offensive operations as Saddam's forces fled Kuwait. It was the view of virtually all senior members of the first Bush National Security Team that overthrowing Saddam by force and occupying all of Iraq would be difficult, costly, and require extensive international support. Mr. Deputy Secretary, the first Bush administration concluded that invading Baghdad in 1991 would have led to mission creep and incalculable human and political costs. And since we already had a containment policy and an embargo policy, I'm wondering, in light of what Secretary Armitage has indicated, that Saddam had no involvement in 9/11, I'm wondering why the mission changed and what made anyone in the national security team believe that it would be easier this time around.
Let me make 2 points. First of all, I think the issue in 1991 wasn't whether to go to Baghdad, although people are free to debate that. I think the real issue in 1991 was whether or not we should have done more to support the uprisings that took place in southern Iraq and northern Iraq. And I think the issue throughout the 1990s, as we discussed with Mr. Kirk earlier, was whether the United States should have done more to help the Iraqi people get rid of Saddam Hussein so that we wouldn't be confronted with the situation we found after September 11th. Secondly...
I'm sorry, Mr. Wolfowitz. I'm sorry, just a moment. Secretary Armitage a few moments ago said that the events of September 11th had nothing to do with Saddam Hussein. You just said that after September 11th we were confronted with some new events. What are the new events?
If you had a long question, can I answer it?
Sure.
Secondly, the containment policy which you referred to was no free lunch. It cost billions of dollars. It cost American lives. We would not have had people in Khobar except because of containment. We would not have had the coal in the Gulf monitoring the blockade if it weren't for the containment policy. We would not have shot down our own helicopter over northern Iraq if it were not for the containment policy. But perhaps most importantly, if you go back and read bin Laden's notorious fatwa of 1998, February 1998, his main target is not Israel. His main target is the American presence in Saudi Arabia and the fact that we were on a continuous basis bombing Iraq. It is the containment policy that was the main cause of that bin Laden cited in his grievance in that same fatwa where he called for killing Americans and Iraqis. The containment policy was very far from cost-free, and it was having real consequences. Now, because there's no proof that Saddam was involved in September 11th, misses some other points. If you go and look at DCI, the Director of Central Intelligence, Mr. Tennant, in his public letter to the Senate Armed Services Committee in October of 2002, he lists a number of ways in which Iraq and al-Qaeda were cooperating with one another. If you look at the sealed indictment of Osama bin Laden that was handed down in February of 1998 by the Southern District of New York, I believe, it says that in 1992-93, bin Laden and Saddam made an agreement not to attack one another and that they would cooperate. Cooperation doesn't mean they jointly planned September 11th. But let's look at something else, which for some reason most people don't know, but it seems to me a rather important fact. The 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center, 8 people were indicted for that bombing. 7 of them are now serving long sentences in American prisons. The only one who escaped to Iraq with the assistance of Iraqi intelligence in Jordan and was harbored in Iraq for the last 10 years. I don't know why. I don't know whether that means Iraq was complicit. I do think there is an issue there. There are issues of Saddam's harboring terrorists, and not just al-Qaeda terrorists. Mr. Abu Nidal and his organization, who are still making bombs that are killing people, at least in Iraq and maybe throughout the Middle East. This was a regime that supported terrorism, and while Mr. Lewis is correct that I have seen some important benefits that can come from having a democratic country, or at least a representative government in Iraq, I still believe Saddam Hussein was a threat to the United States, and the president was fully justified in dealing with that threat.
Thank you. Mr. Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I pursue this a little further, Mr. Kirk rang a bell for me that for a long, long time, for some of us concerned about the same issue, found the bell ringing with a dull thud, and agencies here who might take on some responsibility. That has to do with the poppy fields in Afghanistan. The response I got some years ago from almost every circle here at home was, that's a French problem. 90% of the heroin that impacts Europe coming from those fields in the past. To some extent, new authorities in Afghanistan suppressed the use of poppy resource. And now we find that the terrorists have returned to the poppy fields. There's little doubt that money flows that's supporting the war on terrorism come from that source, among others, but a very significant flow. We have the capacity to eliminate those poppy fields. There is no excuse for us not doing that. And these two gentlemen here today, Mr. Chairman, I believe, have both the responsibility and the capability of making sure action is a part of our purpose. And when we come together next year, maybe not that long, I hope to talk to Secretary Armitage about what he has done to already have eliminated the poppy fields. And I will be talking to the Undersecretary of Defense in another arena about what he has done. But if a year from now they're still there, somebody should be answering to this committee and others. Clearly, Mr. Jackson and I do not agree on every issue around. We agree a lot in the gym. But I must say we agree about one thing for certain. Whether they happen to be French children or children of Europe or children here at home, we do not want them to be exposed to the ravages of heroin addiction. And indeed, if it's, in turn those sources are funding terrorists, we must do something about it. Just spray them tomorrow. Do something about it. Mr. Armitage, Secretary Armitage, with that, I'll never forget a recent meeting. I think several of the people who are here were at that meeting with Kofi Annan in the Capitol building, in which he talked about the potential of future UN role in the development of different governance opportunities in Iraq, and suggested they would play a role, but also said with emphasis, we cannot do that in an environment of insecurity where our people are threatened, et cetera, et cetera. If you want us to play a role, he said, that your forces are going to have to make sure that our people are secure. So Secretary Armitage, would you give me your view of the role the UN is going to play post the 30th of May and beyond?
Yes, sir, I will. I jotted down a few of the elements of a UN Security Council resolution that would address, among other things, this role. But before that, you're perfectly right, and you ought to hold us and others accountable for what happens on the poppy fields. Last year was perhaps the biggest year ever. Biggest year ever. For poppy cultivation and growth in Afghanistan. So you would be wrong if you don't hold us responsible. And some remarkable things have come out of this horror. I just chaired the 11th Counterterrorism Working Group for the Russian Federation. And because of that nexus which you speak of terrorism and drugs and money, we've done an extraordinary thing. My counterpart and I sent out a telegram, to every Russian and U.S. embassy in the world, requiring that the U.S. ambassador, the Russian ambassador, immediately get together to talk about counterterrorism. And further, our counterterrorism czar, if you will, coordinator, Kofor Black, and his Russian counterpart are together traveling to different countries just on these issues. That's never happened before, but that's a lot of talk. That's not action, so we'll look forward to next year. The role of the UN is yet obviously to be fully fleshed out, but let me tell you a number of the elements that we're thinking about as we move forward with the new UN Security Council resolution. One that would in some fashion extend a hand to the new interim Iraqi or caretaker government. It'll address the end of occupation. Say it's over. Occupation is over. Sovereignty has begun. It will support the political transition. It will structure a UN role post-June 30, particularly in supporting the process towards elections and developing of the new constitution. We'll have to address the continuing need for security to enable the Iraqi people to complete the political process, and that goes back to what both Paul and I referred to. UN Security Council Resolution 1511 it makes it very clear that we have the authority to continue security cooperation, but a new UN Security Council resolution, we feel, will be very comforting to others, including Iraqi people, and of course our coalition partners. It will also encourage other nations and regional organizations to get involved in both the security and the reconstruction efforts and address the economic reconstruction activities, including the future of the Development Fund for Iraq. The DFI will belong to Iraqis, be their money, oil revenues and others. And this resolution, among other things, would make that perfectly clear. We, if the Secretary General desires, we would very much welcome a new senior representative of the Secretary General on July 1, if he'd want to appoint one. We would welcome it warmly.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Kirk.
I just want to first thank my colleague from Illinois for highlighting the U.S. military operations in Iraq from 1992 to 2002. They were called Operation Southern Watch and Operation Northern Watch. I'm a veteran of Operation Northern Watch. We flew against the Iraqis, and it was very much a forgotten war. I remember in the pre-mission brief that we would do before getting in the aircraft, we would talk about how the Iraqis were shooting at us every day, and no one back home knew it. And I remembered how I checked up with my buddies in the squadron that the day after Saddam Hussein invited the UN inspectors back in a very dramatic move, his batteries opened up on Americans flying Northern and Southern Watch. And so the disingenuousness was clear to those of us who wore the uniform, and we saw that he was trying to kill us every day. And but for our actions, millions of Kurds were at risk from a third genocide campaign after the two Anfal campaigns. And I think it was wonderful that we provided that protection, but ironic that this very expensive and dangerous war happened for 10 years, supporting the containment policy, which clearly wasn't working. And we, in many ways, forgot the dozens of Americans that entered Iraq every day to provide that protection and got shot at. On a separate issue, though, I want to talk about quickly the Middle East Partnership Initiative. I hope that it's okay with you guys to spend that money in Iranian-supported programs. I think it's very important to support Iranian democracy. I don't know, Secretary Armitage, if you have a thought on that. Generally, we think of this program as devoted to Arab countries, but the title is Middle East. And I think what's happening in Iran would deserve MEPI support. But do you have a thought?
Yeah, I'm a little not opposed to it. I don't know. MEPI funds are spent in the countries. This is not a covert program. It's a certainly overt program that we'd have no ability to spend in the country. But if you're suggesting that MEPI in the Middle East should be open to everyone, including Iranian or something like that, that would be true. I have a feeling the Iranians wouldn't want to participate if the Arabs were doing it. But beyond that,
I think we did outstanding work with the Yugoslav opposition that eventually laid the groundwork for democracy in Serbia, and I think that'd be something that we'd really want to support.
Mr. Kirk, could I go back to what you said at the beginning? You said no one back home knew that you were flying those missions over Iraq. I repeat what I said earlier to Mr. Jackson. Osama bin Laden knew it, and if anyone has any doubt about it, go and read the February 1998 fatwa. It was, as I said, his main cause of grievance against the United States. And if I could also go back to this question about the roughly $350,000 that goes to the INC, it's an unusual, bizarre result of the Iraq Liberation Act. I'm not criticizing the Congress and using that word bizarre, but we get intelligence from many Iraqi parties. Most of that is funded through the intelligence budget. That's why I can't start talking about this in an open session. We get a lot of it from those marvelous Kurds that you like so much. We get a lot of it from other Kurds that you didn't mention. We get a lot of it from the INA, Mr. Alawi's group. Some of it is good, some of it is bad. The same thing is true of what we're getting from the Chalabi group. As a matter of fact, we recently asked our division commanders about the quality of intelligence they're getting from their Iraqi partners, and one division commander said that what they're getting from Chalabi's group is head and shoulders better than the rest. It is saving American lives. That's why we've got to take a balance. Yes, we get some bad stuff and we get some good stuff. It is this unusual fact that there is money overtly appropriated under the Iraq Liberation Act. The State Department correctly was uncomfortable funding something that was the information collection program that was basically intelligence. We agreed that through the Defense Intelligence Agency, we had a mechanism to fund it and to monitor that in the way that intelligence should be monitored. It is being done by a member of the intelligence community. I think it's important to have clarity about that.
Yep, thank you. One other last question. By my count, I think we've spent roughly about $100 million, starting in '97, on the African Contingency Operations Training and Assistance Program, which was renamed the Enhanced International Peacekeeping Capabilities Program, to train up African militaries to help out in peacekeeping. There's almost nothing that we got from that. I think Undersecretary Feith put it well in the press when he said we trained all these people and then they left. In my experience with peacekeeping operations, we never say this about our partners until after the war, but there are countries that contribute troops that are worthwhile, and then there are countries that are completely useless, but we like to have them on the wall like we had in Bosnia so that their flag pictures are up and we look really multinational, but they offer zero capability. And then some countries offer good troops, but they so hamstring these troops that they are also zero in capability. And the best example of that was the Dutch contingent in Srebrenica, who was dedicated with protecting 7,000 Muslim men, and when the Serbian commander ordered them to surrender their weapons, they did. So it was completely useless. So I worry about this Global Peace Operations Initiative, $660 million. It would seem to me that African troops we can spend a ton of money, but they will offer zero net capability to a peacekeeping operation.
No, I've got a slightly different opinion. I thought the question of Liberia showed that some African peacekeeping troops could step up. The main problem is not courage, it's not valor, it's leadership and it's equipment. Valor and courage, they've got plenty. I'm not a fellow who wants to look around and have to call up Paul Wolfowitz every time there's a brush fire or a forest fire in the world and say, we've got to do it first. But until we come up with some solution to have something more than police, a gendarmerie type organization, we're going to be faced with this time and again. And I am going to be calling Paul, just as we did in Haiti. It was not a preferred option. Our troops were splendid, but we need others who can step up. Is it going to work, Mr. Kirk? I don't know. I don't have a better idea right now, but I know that the raw courage and the raw material is there. The real problem we've got in the African militaries, which we were originally talking about, beyond equipping and leadership, is something else. It's called HIV/AIDS, that's where we're losing African soldiers to the scourge of that horror.
Thank you. Ms. Kaptur.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really believe in the old law in physics that for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. It's proven to be true through every decade of my own life in observing human and international affairs. And I wanted to ask Secretary Wolfowitz, I think you and I both fully support a sovereign and independent state of Israel. Sir, do you support a sovereign and truly independent state of Palestine?
Absolutely, and I think this president deserves credit, I think, for being the first president to openly say that that is the solution for the Arab-Israeli, at least the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Do you see any relationship between the lack of resolution on that issue and rising terrorism throughout the world, including especially in the Middle East?
There's certainly a relationship. There are many, many other causes, and many of the people who, I mean, it is significant. I'm not quite sure what to make of it, that bin Laden has always championed other causes way ahead of the Palestinians, and in fact championed Saddam Hussein's cause way ahead of the Palestinians. So there are many other causes, but there is no question that that running sore, the constant images on not only Al Jazeera, which runs all kinds of propaganda, but on normal news channels, constant images of Palestinians suffering under Israeli occupation hurts us throughout the Muslim world.
Well, I was going to say, if you know for the record any nations in which, any Arab nations in which there is rising popular support for the United States, if you could mention it for the record. The way I look at it, the King of Jordan last week decided he didn't want to meet with the president, our president. The president of Egypt has urged caution in some of the manners in which the United States has chosen to express itself in the Middle East. In Pakistan, there have been at least 2 attempts on the life of President Musharraf and some of the newly elected people to their parliament. Might not be the ones we would have chosen. And finally, in Turkey, Turkey was rather skittish through all of this. Can you point to any improvement in the opinion of the United States in any of the countries in which, from which terrorist actions take root? Do you see any wave of support rising in any of these places?
I would not subscribe to a wave of support rising in any of these places, but I would say that to blame all of the difficulties we have simply on a question of Israel and Palestinians is grossly unfair. A lot of, I think, what you see reflected in Arab angst about the United States is actually, in some cases, directed against their own governments, which in some cases are non-transparent, are corrupt to a degree, or suffer from sclerosis, all of which are things which frustrate populations. And I think a very useful and easy outlet for them is us and Israel.
I think you're correct on that. I totally agree with you, Mr. Secretary. And that's why it surprises me that since at least 15 of the 19 hijackers came from Saudi Arabia, one of the most repressive regimes in the world, the administration comes up here constantly and talks about our good friends, the Saudis, and that it seems like we pick our favorite repressors and we bomb the rest. But the wave of terrorism we're experiencing is actually, I think, the tentacles of a political movement that spreads far beyond the boundaries of Iraq. I agree with you there. The lack of resolution of the Palestinian question is only one aspect of it. But I think when the president of our country says that those who are engaging these activities are merely remnants, and Secretary Rumsfeld said that yesterday, it's more than remnants. It's more than just thugs and assassins. You've got your arms around a gigantic political movement running throughout that region. Until somebody admits that, I don't think you're going to find the right solution. And we as a people aren't going to find the right solution. And our people will not feel more secure. They will feel less secure. Our kids are traveling around the world now in Canadian T-shirts because they don't feel safe wearing U.S. flags anymore on their T-shirts. So there's something pretty serious going on here. And to ignore the larger context of the repressive regimes we have supported for all of my adult lifetime and yours, it doesn't seem like we're leaving a more secure world to the future. And I want to go back to an original question I asked Secretary Wolfowitz on who is the architect of the governance of Iraq. And you said Secretary Bremer, Mr. Bremer. And he will be leaving, as I've read in the press, that actually Mr. Negroponte will be taking over there. I just want to think this through with you. Originally we were going to have a constitution in Iraq with an elected assembly through caucuses. That didn't work out, so then we had a modified interim constitution. I take it Mr. Bremer did this. Then we were going to have full sovereignty for Iraq through the UN, and by June 30th it was going to be fine. We've been training all these policemen. Then we were going to have modified, what they're calling modified sovereignty, where Iraq will have no ability to enact laws. They will have only partial command, and nobody's really sure how our force in field is going to relate to the new government. He's leaving. Who's going to be in charge? Who's going to be the architect of what happens there after June 30th while our troops are still in country?
Let me say a couple things. First of all, if people refer to remnants, I'm quite sure the context is talking about the remnants of the Saddam Hussein regime, and that's what we're fighting in Iraq. I don't think anyone that I know of would describe the al-Qaeda terrorists or their various cohorts like the Zarqawi network as remnants. They're a very serious problem. The president
Mr.
last
Secretary,
fall,
if I could interrupt, isn't the remnant word the most frequently one used by the administration?
I don't believe so. No, I don't believe so. If we're talking about remnants of the Saddam Hussein regime, that phrase is used often, and that is a major part of the enemy in Iraq. But the global terrorist threat goes way beyond that. The president went way beyond that, and I think it's important to make it clear. His initiative last fall, which the Middle East, the MEPI initiative is part of, his speech to the National Endowment for Democracy and then later in London on the importance of fundamental reform in the Arab world is a breakthrough. It is a new direction in American policy. I think it is long overdue, and I think it does address one of the causes. When it comes to the process in Iraq, there have not been as many changes as your question implied. There was one substantial change, and I think it was an appropriate one, last November when Ambassador Bremer, responding in large measure to Iraqi demands in the Governing Council and demands in the United Nations, including from France and other countries, that sovereignty need to transfer sooner, set up a new timetable. That timetable, which was established last November, is the one we've been working toward. It sets a transition administrative law that was kind of an interim constitution that was completed at the end of March. That law, in turn, set up a timetable which has three governments. An interim government, which, as Mr. Armitage said, will be there until the end of this year, basically 6 months. It is a very short-lived caretaker government appointed in a kind of negotiation that Mr. Brahimi will lead under the UN auspices. There will then be a transitional government, still a temporary government, but this time elected next January for 12 months. That government will, among other things, have responsibility to write a constitution so that at the end of next year there will be a fully elected constitutional government in Iraq. Part of what Iraqis need to see is a process, not a change overnight. In fact, they're, I think, a little afraid that we're, as Mr. Lewis brought out, that July 1st is suddenly going to mean the end of American support for Iraq. No, it won't. But the Afghans have had the benefit that since December of 2001 of a sovereign government and a process toward a full constitution and a very substantial representative legitimate government. That's what the Iraqis have. I think it's important that we present those facts clearly because there's a lot of confusion in Iraq still as to what happens and doesn't happen on July 1st.
Mr. Chairman, I know my time has expired, and Mr. Chairman, could I just ask for the record if the administration could provide the members of the Governing Council who might have contractual interests in any of the Iraqi rebuilding or provision of services occurring in Iraq, and also if they could provide the difference in salaries and benefits attendant to the contract security and contracted personnel in Iraq versus our U.S. military.
Members
Thank
may
you.
always submit questions for the record. If you'll prepare that question, we'll make sure it's submitted for the record and get a response. We're going to wrap up. I understand Mr. Jackson's asked for 30 seconds to make a clarification. Then Mrs. Lowy is going to have one question. I'm going to have one question. We're going to finish.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for this 30 seconds. I want to make it clear that pre-war intelligence, Mr. Wolfowitz and Mr. Armitage, is costing Americans their lives. And the State Department stopped paying Mr. al-Chalabi because of inconsistencies in his statements. And then after the State Department stopped paying Mr. Chalabi, the Defense Department picked up Mr. Chalabi's $340,000 a month tab. I plan to offer an amendment until I get the answer to my question in the full committee to authorize or prohibit the Defense Department from paying Mr. Chalabi 1 cent until we get the answer to his questions. What was said before is not important, and that the intelligence people who are supposed to do a better job for their country and their government did not do such a good job. I don't think the American people should be footing his tab any longer, and I will offer that amendment before the full
Thank you
committee.
very much.
Thank you,
Mrs.
Mr. Chairman.
Lowy, one question.
I want to thank you both for I want to thank you for appearing before us today. And I just want to follow up, Secretary Armitage, on a statement you made before. You said that the Arab states have stepped up to the plate and that Qatar and Bahrain, while you were there, made some positive statements. You also acknowledged the important role that Egypt must play in preventing weapons movement into Gaza. I'd be very interested, and we probably don't have time today, but if you could perhaps briefly address the help that the Saudis have given us. I understand that they've been helpful in helping us track some of the funds to the terrorists. But I also understand that they have reneged on their commitment to provide $30 million to help build the road in Afghanistan. In fact, a pledge of a grant for the $30 million, I'm not saying 30 billion, I'm taking 30 million, was then turned into a loan. And they haven't even done anything on their part of the road, where our people have really pursued it very aggressively, and the Japanese are getting their act together and moving ahead too. Number one, I'd be interested to know why the Saudis don't feel they have some stake in that region to be helpful. Number two, we're also aware that the cutting back on production of oil by the Saudis, our good friends in the region, has raised the price of oil in the United States, gas prices at the pump. And we understand that maybe right before the election this may turn. I'd be interested in your response to that. I'd also be interested in the assistance that the Saudis could be providing to the Palestinians, people who have homes, jobs, and all these years of the lack of assistance by all the countries in the regions have created a miserable situation for the Palestinians. So as we move forward, the past is past. I'd be interested to know how cooperative the Saudis can be and will be as our good friends in the region, because we know it's very difficult for the Palestinians to take courageous positions unless there is support from our friends in the region.
Thank you. Very briefly, I'll find out where they are on the $30 million pledge on the roads. I remember receiving the pledge, so I guess
We
I'll
were
follow
told
up on it.
specifically that they reneged, and it's now a
soft loan.
It's
Yeah,
a
but
soft loan, and they
My own
haven't
view
done
is
anything.
it ain't over till it's over, so I'll take it for some action. On the question of oil, I do disagree with you. I know what statement the Saudis made about cutting oil production. The price at the time was already at $37 or so a barrel, roughly where it is now. I have not seen them cut production since then. I certainly know of no deal, and I'm very skeptical. I know they budgeted for oil between $22 and $28, and so every oil-producing nation right now is benefiting enormously. But I don't
I
think
thought it's at 37 cents, and that's why the revenues, $37,
Yeah.
and that's why the revenues of Iraq are going up. But any event,
Third, the cooperation that we have with the Saudis is pretty varied. In a closed session, Paul or I can tell you about what went on before and during the war. The counterterrorism cooperation, because they've suffered horribly. The last two times I was there, they've been bombed. And they've lost a lot of policemen and SWAT team people recently because they're uncovering cell after cell after cell of people who are out to kill them, the royal family, and their way of life. Has their cooperation been uniform across the board? Absolutely not. But to get back to Ms. Kapter's question, in every single country, including in Saudi Arabia, there's some winds of change. And the whole initiative, which Paul referred to, the President, the Greater Middle East Initiative, is not trying to impose our values or our way of life on any Middle Eastern country. It is to take advantage of those winds of change, whether it's in liberalization for women or in education for women where that exists, to give it a little wind, or whether it's in NGOs where they're starting to come up in different Arab countries, to give them some wind. All of these are elements of a vibrant civil society, which if we're going to have successful relationships in the long run with Middle Eastern countries, they're going to have.
to be continued.
To be continued, yes. Let me just end with one question, actually two questions here. One for Secretary Wolfowitz here, that I think it's important that we get some understanding from you. Last year, Secretary Wolfowitz, Congress gave the Department of Defense some limited authority for training, equipping the new military forces of Iraq and Afghanistan. This year, the department is seeking authority to spend up to $500 million, and I quote the language that's been submitted in the President's request, with the concurrence of the Secretary of State to provide assistance to military or security forces in Iraq, Afghanistan, and this is the ringer, and other friendly nearby regional nations, unquote, to combat terrorism and support U.S. military operations. Now, this is a request that's in front of, of course, the Defense Subcommittee, but if it's granted, it's going to have impact decisions that we're going to make regarding funding and authorities for security assistance programs that's under the jurisdiction of this subcommittee. So my question to you is why do you need such authority? Doesn't that authority exist now for the Department of State to provide the U.S. government with the authority to train and equip foreign militaries? Is it a matter of finding the funding, or is it providing DOD with new authorities here?
Part of it is to be the basic philosophy, the spirit of this is not to substitute for foreign assistance programs, which need to be done in a consistent, orderly, long-term way and managed with the full scope of foreign policy considerations in mind. The thought is that we get on battlefield situations where it becomes extremely critical to our men and women in uniform to have the best possible allies on the battlefield with them. And sometimes you run into funding shortages because you're dealing with situations that were unanticipated. And I would note, as I think you understand, we're not asking for appropriation, we're asking for authority. We're not going to dig into that authority unless it's critically needed, because it will come out of other DOD accounts. But it is the case that our commanders can spend freely, for example, on tank ammunition, but don't have the authority to spend money on body armor for Iraqi police, for example, even though those Iraqi police may be able to perform a critical role substituting for Americans. So that's the spirit of it. As you noted correctly, we would not propose to do anything without the concurrence of the State Department.
If I may, there's also, we have worked out mutually between us, this would be an annual authority. It's not a blanket authority.
How would this process be coordinated? Would it be an interagency process of coordinating it? Would it be through the NSC? Who's going to mediate differences when there's one between state and defense over such a thing?
The two secretaries speak every morning, and Paul and I speak just about every day. When it gets to our level, that's not where the problems are. We generally don't fight, so I don't think you'll have a big difference of opinion. They're not going to want to dig into their money unless it's a serious problem. And I'm more likely to want to dig into their money, I think, than they are.
So it really will require joint concurrence. Mr. Chairman, could I beg 1 minute just to make a comment on the record, because with respect to Mr. Jackson's last comments, the Defense Department did not take over funding of the Chalabi program because we were eager to do so. In fact, I'd be delighted if I could stop having to answer questions on this score. We did it because this information collection program was clearly intelligence, not something that the State Department was comfortable doing. We have the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is a part of the intelligence community, and they were capable of doing it. It is not a simple issue, Ms. Jackson, because we, in fact, are getting intelligence through that program that is saving American lives. And as I said to Mr. Kirk, you get good stuff, you get bad stuff. I would like to see this whole thing put under the same rubric as other intelligence programs and weighed in the same way. But no one should be under illusions that if you want to get information about the enemy and what they're plotting, that you're also going to get some things that are wrong.
Thank you. I'm going to end with one final question. Different part of the world. I just want to get you both on record on this. I've been a strong supporter of the Andean Counter-Drug Initiative. This year, both Departments of State and Defense are seeking a change in the existing law as far as the number of U.S. contractors and military presence in Colombia, from 400 to 600 for contractors and from 400 to 800 for the military. My question for both of you, this is kind of the ghost of Vietnam thing, which I sometimes think is never going to be exercised as long as there's some of us who are Vietnam veterans around here. But until that time, the question is this: does this mean the United States is getting more deeply involved in the conflict in Colombia?
We have consulted widely together on the Hill on this issue. What it does mean is that the government of Colombia, particularly President Uribe, is stepping up on a whole host of issues. They're not just going after the drugs, they're going after the kidnapping, they're going after the terrorists, and in so doing, we feel we need to up both the contractors and the military because of the plan to support Planned Patriotica. We need this increased manning levels. The fact of the matter is that I think our general overall military size, the size of our military unit, is the biggest sort of prohibition on mission creep that you'll have, because these are not things that our commander in Southcom or anywhere else can do willy-nilly. We don't have that many extra personnel, so I understand the fear. I got the same ghost you have, but we don't have the same abilities we had back then in terms of people under arms.
Did you want to add anything?
I just would add, I think what Uribe is doing is remarkable. He's a real stand-up
also
guy, is
agree with
achieving real results, and it's an opportunity for us to get some success that will save us in the long run.
Secretary Armitage, this is absolutely the last little thing. The Columbia initiative is straight-lined in the President's request. How are you going to pay for going from 400 to 600 contractors?
We'd have to make some judicious choices, wise choices. I'll provide for the record, I don't have it in my mind.
Okay, because there is no increase.
No, that's right. It's
Request
731.
of costs for it. Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, just a one-liner, take the liberty. I think it's important that we discuss the Article 98 issue concerning South Africa. We certainly provided IMET to many countries who have human rights problems, and I understand the seriousness of this issue, but we also understand the tremendous efforts on the part of the military in South Africa to move ahead and to reform, and at some point I think we should be discussing that issue.
And I hope also we can show you some of the success we've had with this. We just signed up our 88th and 89th country to Article 98.
I want to thank both of our witnesses very much for their cooperation this morning and giving us the time they have. I think this has been a very important hearing and very valuable for us, and we appreciate you taking the time to be with us this morning. The subcommittee stands adjourned.
Next on C-SPAN 2, Senate Democrats comment on the situation in Iraq. After that, Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi. Later, we'll re-air this hearing on spending for Iraq and foreign security assistance.
He's written about empires past